Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Hope Matrix. I am super grateful to have you here and excited about our guests, Lian. And I don't even know how to say your last name. Can you say that for me, Zeitz?
Zeitz, Lian Zeitz.
That is so funny. I'm just realizing that I've worked with you for so long and I've never even asked you that. Oh, that's funny. Well, I love Lian and I think you all are going to love him as well. I worked with him. He does some really amazing global mental health work and he's been on several kind of panels that I've hosted or supported with and been just a great voice in the space. And he recently took up a new academic pursuit that I want him to share with you as well. But really grateful to have you here. It's so great to see you too, Lian. How are you?
Oh, thank you. I'm doing super well and happy to be here calling from Seattle, Washington on the west coast of the US. It's a rainy day here. Yeah, and just, as we close out 2020, I'm really excited for this discussion because it's timely and relevant, particularly for young people.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen so many changes this year. And I know, going into the year, we had a real challenge with global mental health, specifically as it relates to youth. And this year has really only added to our challenges around that. This pandemic has impacted so many people in so many different ways. And I think too in ways that we haven't even seen. So, I think the coming year, it's going to be super important that we support youth in this space and kind of address it. And I know you've been doing work in global mental health for a long time and specifically as it relates to youth. So I appreciate you taking some time to be here and share what you know with the world and see how we can I think have more hope around the issue overall too. So that's awesome. How did you first of all get started in the space?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. My work in mental health really stems from my own lived experience in therapeutic treatment when I was making a common transition that many young people go through from middle school into high school, and the academics change and your whole life turns different. I experienced a rapid crash of my self-esteem and my academic achievement and kind of my social protections, and was just in crisis at a pretty young age. And that led me into being in and out of therapeutic treatment for the rest of my high school experience. And I was privileged to be able to have options and kind of try different things. But overall, it was a really tough time. And it gave me a pretty good firsthand look into some of the system that exists for supporting youth mental health and some of the strategies that are used to do that. And I was pretty underwhelmed mostly by the fact that I was rarely kind of made an active agent of my own care process and asked the simple questions of like, what do I want to measure my own success by, and involved in the level of decision making that I thought I could be. And when I left treatment and kind of started getting into college, I got more into kind of mental health activism and advocacy, kind of yelling about how the system wasn't working, but particularly being loud about the fact that there's such an untapped potential to be engaging and listening to young people in the way that they weren't being. And at the same time, there was other movements happening around lived experience and just the voice of people in systems to make it more resonant for them. And so I had gotten a lot of positive affirmation at that time. And then in college, I started looking at this world of global mental health and started thinking about mental health across cultures and how it manifests in different societies, and was just fascinated by this kind of concept that there was such an unaddressed, untapped issue everywhere. And my setting in the US, it hadn't been figured out, and there was just so much to be uncovered. And so that really like unlocked a deep passion in me to kind of work in the field. And then I started, I call myself a young mental health groupie. Like when I was like 19, I was like flying to the conferences on my own, like summer spending to meet with these senior people. And just as I reflect, I was just like a very young, passionate person trying to wrap my head around what was going on. And it transpired into helping form an organization called Cities Rise that's based in New York that works on young people's mental health and well-being, and then has transpired into being involved in a number of global efforts that are working to address young people's mental health and well-being, working with the UNICEF and the UN and the WHO, but then actually just having a lot of deep relationships with activists and actors on the ground across the world who were really in a common shared effort of trying to change how things are. Yeah, and so that was really my journey. And just I think lastly is that I'm currently, over the summer, I left my full time role at Cities Rise to take up a part time position as the director of love and compassion as I started graduate school in a Master's of Divinity program that is focused on Tibetan Buddhism, but really looking at kind of post religious theories on spirituality and wellness. So, really looking at spiritual dimensions of healing from a non denominational perspective. And that just comes from my own healing and then what I've heard from young people around the world that they say they're looking for.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, and there's so much there to unpack. I mean, the first thing I just want to say is thank you so much for speaking out and for getting engaged. So when you feel that sense of despair, you can either sit back and really do nothing, and you can get into that hopelessness cycle, or you can get back to positive feelings and taking inspired action. And that's what you did with mental health, and, that's what I as well tried to do when I was young and passionate about the space, and so I really admire, so many times when we see such big global challenges, we tend to think of them as too big, so we don't do anything about it, and that's a very hopeless kind of, response to have, and so, that's I'm passionate about teaching the how-to of hope because of that very thing, and I think you're a great model for that, that instead of getting into the despair around the system itself and the complexity of changing the system, you chunked it down and you started taking action where you could and where you could influence. And I've seen you do that throughout the space. And I really admire that so much about you.
No. Oh, well, thank you so much. I mean, it's interesting as I've been learning more about Buddhism and other kind of moral and ethical frameworks for how and why we engage in the world. Hope comes up a lot. And one of kind of the formulations of hope is like having compassion and like just a deep sense of care and like willingness to go beyond yourself to support something. And that, you know, when I thought about, my friends or other people that would be experiencing unjust ways of being, it created a deep care and concern to do something about it. And the hope was, really rooted in that care for the broken system, not necessarily that it wasn't broken and that it's not really systematically unjust. It was that because I cared so much, there was a source of hope that arose, and I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that. Like we get so engulfed in how much we care that we can also get into despair, and it's like sometimes turning that care into hope.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I just recorded our 30-day hope challenge this weekend and we had a lesson on empathy and that was really the key lesson on empathy. I mean, it's so important for us to have empathy and it's also important not to take on that energy. So to have compassion and love and understanding of other people. But I think a lot of us, especially in the global mental health space, what can happen is we can feel too much and care too much, and then it starts to impact our own mental health. So there's that fine line between caring a lot about other people and wanting to serve and support and help, especially if you know a lot about the space and how to help, and then kind of having that boundary in line and focusing on self care as well in the process, which is, I think a challenge that I've seen for a lot of people in global mental health.
Yeah, I've had that challenge myself, and before my role at Cities Rise, I worked on clinical care teams with young people as kind of a lived experience advocate to help the care process to have a young person speaking to a young person, and it was overwhelming for me. I was young, and I probably had a lot to learn at the time, but that like overload of empathetic resonance was hard for me. But interestingly, what I've been thinking a lot on is about where we like store and what our source of empathy really is. And I think sometimes we can, and what I did a lot of was overplace my actual understanding and shared reality with another person to develop empathy rather than having more a respect and admiration and care for what other people are going through. And that and so going through that process of really kind of almost saying that I can have empathy, but it only goes to an extent that my lived experience is shared with that other person's. But the reality is that they're so different that it's more actually a care and concern than making it more about how I resonate with what they're going through. And that's something I've been working through really recently, and just trying to figure that out. But it also makes you more hopeful about how to engage because it's a question of what's in and outside of your control. And I think that that conversation really helped when thinking about like the blend of empathy and hope and how they all play together.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's an exercise we have our kids do and adults, and we did in this latest program, but control the controllables, and we focus and spend so much of our time focusing on what we can't control and very little on what we can, and it leads to a lot of hopelessness, when you focus on what you can't control, so that's definitely also a key to hope. I do wanna, like, talk a bit more, in depth about spirituality because it's such an important conversation, and it's been like such a process for me to engage the language around spirituality in the work we're doing on hope and so much of the research around hope or some of the research it really supports having a spiritual or religious or whatnot basis and yet some people have been oppressed by religion and harmed and yeah, really hurt in that respect, and I believe hope is everyone, has access to hope, and so there's not kind of a right or wrong answer, and so the fact that you're really delving into this more deeply, and especially from a youth perspective, I really wanna hear a lot more about, so I'm just, curious on your own journey, how has spirituality played a role, and what does that even really mean to you?
Yeah, thank you. So I like to view spirituality in its like broadest, most inclusive sense, which is people's engagement with sources of meaning, purpose, and the unknown, just broadly. And that foundation is like a shared like human experience that people come into contact with those questions, pursuits, histories, religious orientations, or other things. And what's so fascinating to me is that it is such a ubiquitous experience of people encountering those sorts of questions. And I've been doing a lot of historical literature and reading and research on just the inspiration for different religious traditions, whether it's Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Taoism, all of these different kind of foundations. And at their core, it's grappling with questions of meaning and purpose, and creating a space for the unknown in a way that doesn't have to have material answers. And that is, I think, something that when I was struggling in my own mental health crisis, I was yearning for was something that asserted and explained kind of the way in which the world is so complex that was outside of like why I was stuck in treatment at the age of 15. Like I couldn't fathom that. And for me, it was actually connecting to what is called more of like nature based spirituality, which is, although I was raised like reformed in a Jewish community, I never really identified as Jewish and I didn't identify as spiritual. But when I had kind of a moment of like kind of witnessing something divine, it was when I was in nature. And that was kind of how I identified sources of unknown and power and mystery that created like joy and a space of like possibility for me. And so then, and from that point, I've always engaged in kind of nature based spirituality, which is both connecting to like the earth and the ecosystem, but feeling that I'm connected to something bigger. And interestingly, when I talk to young people across the world about what they're grappling with and the questions they're asking, they're often trying to reconcile coming from like a religious heritage, whether it's being Catholic or Hindu or other things, and living in a globalized kind of postmodern world that blends and creates hybrid models of all of these different belief systems. And so my main interests are in like what does that, post religious like world look like, where we're more bound by our moral and ethical frameworks of like being than necessarily like adopting a religious tradition, even though I think there's space for all of them. And so I'm really diving into Buddhism and Judaism and Christianity right now, and yeah, it's just so interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I know I used to have such a, you know, I because my dad died by suicide, and when that happened, he was ostracized by a number of religions, and and Catholicism at the time didn't even really recognize that, and made all these judgments about it, and I thought, "How can that?" And I then just kind of distanced myself from all of it and didn't like it, and instead, I've really reconciled that, and now I'm just really curious about all of that, and kind of what works and what doesn't work. And I'm glad to hear your just your commentary on that. That's definitely what we teach kids, and how we kind of added the elements of spirituality and or religion, or however you want to look at it, in the program that we're teaching. And that's really about connecting with something greater than yourselves, holding things sacred, nature. We added a lesson that I'm excited about on wonder and awe. So, experience of wonder and awe, and looking at the seven wonders of the world and just being really kind of amazed in it. And I think we lose a lot. We get used to everything at our fingertips now, and we kind of lose some of that perspective. So bringing that back to kind of youth. What is your experience with other youth in the space as it relates to religion? I mean, do you see that as a critical part to their healing, or yeah, how are they experiencing it? And how can we as activists kind of talk to them about it too?
Yeah, it's super interesting because as I've like looked at the landscape in the mental health field, there's a narrative of like we need to engage religious leaders to talk about mental health within their communities, but it does hold this like divide between like the healing that's taking place in those religious centers and the like scientific approaches towards intervening when there's like a mental health issue, when I really see them as much more blended, and I think the young people I talk to do as well. And so it's interesting because, for instance, in May, we did a global survey of young people and talked about where they're deriving hope from. And one of the common answers, particularly from places like Colombia and Kenya, was like God and faith in God. And so it's just so important to note that like despite maybe young people not necessarily going and being active church members or different things like this dimension of faith is core to how they view and experience the world. And then the other is that religious communities are some of the most strong socially connected places that young people encounter in their life. And so there's a lot of different interreligious work, but youth groups within faith communities are normally where a lot of young people that I know access like powerful forms of social connection and community that is different than they see in the outside world. And so for young people, the connection is generally inseparable because they've seen so many touch points of it. What I think becomes hard for young people to grapple with is like why is there such a barrier to blending these kind of clearly compatible areas to like help people. And I think there's a lot of exciting work happening in that area. And then the other thing that I think young people are grappling with a lot right now is just climate change and this like kind of existential reality that can create a lot of hopelessness. And there's so much research coming out around climate anxiety and hopelessness due to the climate emergency and all of these things. And I really think that's like a spiritual question for young people because they're witnessing like a profoundly intangible thing, but yet it matters so much to them. And so navigating that is, I think a big question for our time right now too. And it's something that comes up with young people a lot. So I want to mention that as, when I oriented around nature-based spirituality, I think this kind of conception of the like kind of more like humanist values and like what is humanity going to do is how young people are orienting a lot. And there's a resurgence of religion in itself, I think, amongst youth, just not what it used to be.
Yeah, just in a different way. Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One, I when I started this work, it was in Ghana, started learning about the human rights abuses and kind of how they're treating kind of mental health issues and the chaining and the, exercising the demons and all of these things kind of happening. And I was, so disturbed by it. And yet it's the religion and spirituality plays such an important and key part of that community. So it's been a really delicate balance of how do you engage with these groups and also address the human rights abuses that are going on, and how do you kind of shift how society speaks around that, and how they're kind of addressing that. So, there has been a real shift, I think, in the years, but still so much more to be done. And I think as we learn about the biology of the brain and health, and as they kind of understand that more and bigger populations and how it's all interconnected. I think it'll help kind of lend to that conversation. And yeah, the environmental challenges. I mean, I like what Dr. Balkin is doing around 1 billion. But I mean, talk about feeling hopeless. I mean, hopelessness again, it's a feeling of despair and sense of helplessness. And it seems to youth is such a massive crisis, and to many people that care a lot about it. And what can we be doing? And I think applying a hopeful mindset, I'm really interested eventually in getting deeper into that conversation around it, because if we go into hopelessness about the environment, then nothing kind of productive will happen in terms of change. But I think there are a lot of groups doing innovative things and to help address the very many, many challenges that we face in that respect.
Yeah, totally. And I think it goes back to what we were talking earlier about like how people, and particularly young people, get to channel their care and concern for the world in healthy and productive ways for themselves. Because for instance, with the climate, it's because young people care. They feel deeply attached, but there's this moment where it can lead into a despair or a source of hopefulness. And so I think that for so many different things. And I think what is interesting from a neuroscience and a epigenetic is we're seeing evidence of humans' innate kind of capacity for being caring and being kind of a socially oriented creature that has, they've done studies on babies and them automatically before being taught having kind of intuitions to help and serve. And so it's, how do you unlock that in a healthy way? And I think, hope is that result of it going in a more healthy direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's great. I'm so excited for your new program. And you just finished your first semester. How did it go?
It was really good. Thanks for asking. It's a 3-year program that has two parts. One is kind of a theological study of world religions with a focus on Tibetan Buddhism. And then the other is getting a clinical chaplaincy certification. And the chaplaincy piece is what is translates to becoming like a spiritual caregiver, or somebody that is trained in engaging in spiritual questioning with people. And so it's just been really exciting to both get like a theological foundation, but then also get like practical skills and like how do you actually have a supportive conversation with someone that isn't bringing like my own baggage or my own perceptions of what spirituality should mean. And so that's been just like exciting to learn about, and I hope to translate that into like applied practices in the youth mental health space globally, because I think the spaces are just so connected, but the bridge has not been made yet.
Yeah, I love that. No, I think that's great. And it's so necessary and needed. So I'm excited to see how that kind of unfolds for you. Yeah. So is there anything else you want to share with everyone before we kind of check out? I'm so appreciative. I've loved this conversation. It's so good to have you and to be chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you. I guess one source of my hopelessness was not being asked and supported in ways that I thought I could be. And I think when I was then engaged and supported and allies came behind me, like my despair turned into hope slowly. And I think that's the opportunity we have with so many young people in despair right now, because we know the pandemic particularly has like a significant impact on young people's mental health and well-being. And that means that we need to, have more creative and thoughtful responses. And I think Mental Health America just came out with a bunch of research saying that, like 1 in 4 young people want to do more in their community with mental health. 1 in 2 young people want to have this practical skills to be able to help a friend and family member. And so I do think there's a lot to be hopeful for, and we have a lot of like practical ways to respond to these issues, and young people are at the center of those responses. And so that brings me a lot of personal hope, and I know that the future looks bright because of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so if someone knows of someone that's struggling right now, like a parent knows a youth or something, what is the best, like what do you think is the best approach, or what does the youth want to hear?
I mean, it's always that's like the million trillion dollar question. I think, because it's always so hard. I mean, as someone who genuinely encounters crises within mental health in my community and my family, each time it occurs, you have to create a new roadmap for how to respond. But the few things that I think we do know is that, seeking help and getting professional support is a good thing to do. I think what we do know, particularly like around suicide and suicidality, is that it's okay to talk about, and confronting it is way more practical and useful than letting it slide by. And so it's okay to talk about. And I always kind of implore people to do research to uncover tensions between any stigma that they may have, to be able to make informed decisions. So understanding the different types of therapy that exist and the different types of therapists that exist, understanding what it might look like for you to explore different mental health options, rather than it being saying that there's like one approach to solving this issue. And so I think when people encounter that, as we're embarking on that healing journey and we're willing to take multiple different angles and look at it in different ways, you normally get the best results. And yeah, and for people struggling, I just you're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely not alone, and such a great message. And I know, so many people are struggling right now. And so that's such a key thing for them all to hear. So yeah, and two, I mean, there's so much we don't know about mental health and brain health and how the brain works. And so your point about exploring what works for you and the options that work for you, again, really key and critical, and being open. And when something doesn't work, don't think that nothing will work, and keep trying, you know? I mean, I personally had many, many different ways I had to address my mental health until I found solutions, and each person is definitely different. So, yeah, that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much for being here. It was so great talking to you and catching up with you again. I miss working with you more, and you've been such a bright light in the global mental health space, and I really appreciate it so much. So, thank you, and take good care of yourself up in Washington. And thank you all for listening. It was great. Hope you enjoyed chatting with Lian, and we'll put links to his info as well, and to Cities Rise and all the great work Cities Rise is doing in the podcast kind of bio. So thank you so much.
Thank you.